Off Martinique by Stephen A. Roddewig. Maxwell had not come to St. Croix light because he dreamed of the grandeur of isolation and all the mind can achieve when left to its own capacities. Indeed, he had come to man the light because the governor of Martinique had deemed him in need of isolation after his third major theft. After his third subsequent escape from jail, the island's authorities had decided a new kind of prison was needed. The Isle of St. Croix, for which the lighthouse took its name, lay at the precipice of the blue-green Caribbean to its west and the shelf of the Atlantic to its east, plunging away into crushing oblivion. St. Croix's coral reefs and shifting sands stood as a gateway between these two seas, and a lighthouse was a necessary marker of the dangers they brought. Maxwell, upon first learning of his new confines, had scoffed. How would a lighthouse hold him when the island was surrounded by water that entertained all sorts of boats and swimmers? His bravado had fallen away when the gunship had fetched up in the inlet formed by St. Croix's crescent shape. The Atlantic raged on the eastern side, and the currents swirled the warmer tropical waters on the western side, forming riptides that promised to overwhelm and drown anyone caught in them. Moreover, the gendarmerie had left him only a rowboat without sail or even bailing bucket to attempt the long voyage of escape across 20 miles of open sea to the next piece of land. Maxwell may have still attempted to row the strait, but again, the currents promised to swamp his boat and drag him down. A professional criminal whose patience had paid off before, Maxwell settled into his current sentence, always with an eye to the keyhole. Yet, though his calm remained, no solutions had presented themselves in the first 2 months of his sentence. A relief ship appeared once a month with supplies, but it was always accompanied by guards with rifles who threatened to shoot Maxwell if he even approached the dock. The governor's cabal had dealt quite a vexing challenge, but Maxwell did not despair. He occupied himself by testing the waters around the lighthouse, quite literally, fashioning buoys and studying how the currents took them to determine if the riptides were as ferocious as they appeared. So far, the experiments had all confirmed what his eyes saw. He also carried out his duties, however begrudgingly. The beacon and its rotating mechanism needed constant attention. St. Croix's lenses required daily polishing, and its reservoir held only enough oil for a single night's illumination. If the gendarmerie had not chosen this feature themselves, then they most certainly had viewed it positively when selecting the lighthouse for his sentence. Even if Maxwell succeeded in escaping the Crescent Island, his flight could only be concealed for the span of one night and the day after, at the most. When the beacon failed to light the next night for lack of fuel, the gunboats would come looking at dawn. The same fact meant the authorities could say with almost absolute certainty when the last keeper, Klaus Pollard, had vanished from the island. Vanished was the official term because the inspectors had found no signs of flight or struggle. The emergency fetch still lay staked to the beach, and the tricolor flag of the French Republic still fluttered in the breeze. Inside the keeper's quarters, breakfast lay cold inside of a neat kitchen. So little stood out that it was harder to believe that Pollard was gone than hidden away somewhere. After a search of the lighthouse and surrounding island, the only thing the inspectors could find out of the ordinary was a single winding track through the sand. It led toward the beacon, smooth and concave, but no return track could be found. The working theory was that someone had come for Pollard and dragged him away, but who had come for him, and to what end, remained unclear. Maxwell paused from cranking the counterweight to ponder that fact. The man could simply have fallen into the ocean and drowned, yet that never seemed to enter the realm of possibility for those who had investigated. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Maxwell resumed cranking. Wherever Klaus is, I'm sure he doesn't miss this oven. The counterweight finally back to its starting position at the top of the tower, Maxwell retreated down the winding iron staircase to the cool stones of the cellar. In the foundation of St. Croix, a great cistern lay to collect rainwater. It was the only source of fresh water on the entire island, save for a few emergency casks that stood beside it. Maxwell sipped from the wooden ladle before dumping the rest over his forehead. All in all, not the worst prison I've been in, Maxwell thought, as the cool water dripped from his long black hair. One Caribbean summer day into his 3rd month of exile, Maxwell woke to find he had dozed off in the anteroom where the great machines that rotated the beacon were kept. Naturally, sweat clung to every inch of his body as the noonday sun cooked the bricks he leaned against, but it wasn't the heat that had woke him. Far below, at the base of the tower, came the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. A single forceful blow that echoed up the tower to where Maxwell lay 80 feet above. Scrambling to his feet, Maxwell started to descend the stairs and swung his head over the iron railing to view the floor far below. Nothing was out of the ordinary until a gust blew the wooden door back into the room. The sunlight revealed a wet slick leading from the doorway into the cellar. Reaching the ground floor in a flurry of steps, Maxwell searched about for a weapon, cursing that the gendarmerie had left him no gun or axe. He settled on a wooden oar hung above the stove. Before advancing into the cellar, he paused to close the outside door, only to find that the latch had broken in two. Turning, Maxwell stilled his breathing and crept his way down the stone steps. Nothing stirred below. Nothing lay out of place, but Maxwell's nostrils flared. The normal faint scent of mildew had been replaced with something acrid. Maxwell tracked the source to a streak of water and accompanying blue-black residue that wound its way along the cobblestones. The path continued up the stone wall of the cistern. Or at the ready, Maxwell took a final step, ready to strike whatever waited on the other side. Nothing moved in the black water. Moreover, something was missing. The cistern level had decreased drastically. How could the level be lower with something in it? Then the convict keeper realized he had been looking at it all wrong. The trail was it leaving. His eyes turned from the cistern to the wet marks and then back to the pool. Then what the hell was in the cistern this whole time? Maxwell retraced his steps back up the stairs and out the doorway. The track continued down the steps, already evaporating into the equatorial sun as it moved into the sand. Finally, the winding groove reached the sheltered inlet on the western side of the island and vanished at the tide's edge. From water to water. Maxwell stared at the blue-green surf, but the waves revealed no secrets. Turning back toward the light, the keeper felt a tremor as he took the first step closer to the red and gray stones. He kicked sand over the tracks as he went. Down the stone stairs he descended once again, following the drying tracks back to the cistern. Lifting the lantern off the water cask where he had set it earlier, Maxwell turned his full attention to the black bottom of the cistern. He leaned over the cold wall and lowered the lantern until it shone just above the surface. Black water reflected the yellow glow, except for the far edge of the cistern. Where there should only be darkness, something else lay beneath the surface. It was the smallest hint of white, enough contrast in the still water to catch Maxwell's eye. Placing the lantern on the lip of the cistern, the keeper plunged his oar into the water. Probing toward the white reflection, he pushed the paddle to the bottom and swished it back and forth. It only took a few moments until his oar struck something. Not the scraping stones of the cistern, but something lighter, something that moved along the bottom. Maxwell was too focused on retrieving the object to stop and wonder at its identity. Only when he had moved it back to within the lantern's radius did he notice his breathing had quickened. Gripping the stone wall, Maxwell reached his other arm into the cool water. His hand found the object quickly. Smooth, definitely not a stray stone. After several moments, Maxwell found a suitable grip and pulled it from the murk. As it neared the surface, the outline looked somewhat familiar. Then Maxwell gasped. Mon Dieu! His fingers were threaded through the eye sockets of a human skull. For a moment, he nearly threw the horrible thing away from him, but another voice managed to speak over his pounding heart. This means something. Still unsure what to do with it, Maxwell set the skull on the water cask where the lantern had rested. Only then did he realize the skull had sat in the same water he had been drinking from for the last 3 months. A short while later, Maxwell returned from vomiting into the sand. He continued to dredge the bottom and soon had found more bones. With his improvised search method, he could only assume more were waiting to be found. At least I've not found flesh in here. It was as comforting a thought as he could muster. Days had passed since Maxwell had raised the distress flag, a signal to any passing ships to render assistance or, at the very least, inform the authorities in the nearest port. Days had passed, but no one had come. Left on his own, Maxwell had done his best to piece together where the skeleton had come from, but he had only the bones and their location to go on. Did the strange tracks have anything to do with these remains? Maxwell could not shake the feeling that it was all connected. As he hauled oil for the lantern from the storage shed, Maxwell paused to roll up his sleeves. The sun had only just risen, and already it promised to be another sweltering day on St. Croix. Leaning down to pick the oil bucket back up, Maxwell spied a pair of initials emblazed on the side. K.P. The bucket dropped from Maxwell's hand and spilled its tarry liquid across the sand. Klaus Pollard. Could it be? His mind raced back to the finer details of the story one of the gendarmerie officers had told him on the passage to St. Croix. No signs of a struggle. Nothing out of place. As if he were just hiding someplace. That's what the wheezing man said. Finally, a winding track leading through the sand that definitely was not human footprints. The same creature that had been living undetected in the cistern could have eaten Klaus before Maxwell had been sentenced to the island. As soon as the theory had occurred to him, Maxwell realized it would be nearly impossible to prove. Several attempts to dredge the bottom had yielded more bones, but no clothing or personal items that might confirm the identity of the skeleton. He could not even determine if it was a male or female. More proof could be in the black pool, but he would only find it by draining the cistern, and drinking water was scarce enough on this island already. Following the tradition of his many weeks on the island, Maxwell returned to the cistern once the oil reserve had been filled and the counterweight wound for the next evening's illumination. Breathing in the damp, musty air of the cellar, Maxwell sighed before taking a swig from the ladle. He had reconciled drinking from the same water as the skeleton. The demands of the summer heat had left him with no alternative. Besides, he had already been doing it unknowingly without any side effects. Regardless, his stomach churned with each gulp. Worse, Maxwell's sanctuary had been breached. Even now he swore he could feel the eyeless sockets of the skull following him across the room from its perch on the water barrel. Maxwell started to flick the remaining water back into the cistern when he paused. Something in the ladle had splashed. He turned the ladle to look closer and found a tiny creature swimming around the wooden cup. Moving it beneath the lantern's gaze, Maxwell swore it looked like the creatures he had seen strung up by the dozen in the fish markets. Ongui. Eels. The mysteries of this cistern deepen. Maxwell retrieved a dust-rimmed drinking glass from the workshop table and filled the glass so that the eel could have a larger area to swim in. He placed it back on the table. A scan of the black pool did not reveal any more creatures, but considering the size of this specimen, they could easily be missed. Still, Maxwell reasoned, wouldn't the surface be at least a little disturbed with their movement? It shone back placid and unflinching beneath his lantern. Maxwell turned back to the eel swimming about in his water glass. It never slowed in its constant circuits of the cylinder, but after several moments, Maxwell determined it had a dark blue dorsal fin running along a thin, black body, all streamlined for quick movements. 2 yellow eyes flashed by Maxwell's face as he rested his chin on the work table. His stomach rippled at the thought that this creature had also come from his drinking water. Another 5 days had passed with still no response to the distress flag. St. Croix had earned its lighthouse by claiming a dozen ships during past centuries, and these tough lessons had imparted healthy caution into any captains familiar with the waters. No one was coming until the next resupply ship, and Marie was not due for 6 days. No matter. Maxwell had almost forgotten the skeleton he had found, though its bones lay only feet away across the cellar. He found himself watching the eel, which he had named Julian, for hours. Every day seemed to yield new discoveries. First, Julian had surprised Maxwell by almost doubling his length in the span of a day. Then streaks of bright blue had developed in his black torso. Most recently, he had revealed pectoral fins on each side, which allowed Julian to hover in place within the glass. Maxwell swore the yellow eyes followed him across the room sometimes, but then he reminded himself this was a fish who had no capacity for thinking. That was man's domain. To Julian, the world outside the glass was the horizon, the same way a man did not question the sky each day. It simply existed. Today, the beacon's Fresnel lens polished and the other tasks seen to, Maxwell finished his daily walk along the quarter-mile strip of sand and beach grass and returned to dry away the sweat in his collar. Setting the lantern down upon the water casks, Maxwell picked up an old oil bucket from the corner. All throughout Julian's short lifetime, one fact had remained constant. The eel continued to grow at amazing speed. Too much longer, and the fish would fill the entire glass, or escape. Already Maxwell was certain the ferocious swimmer could crack the glass if it struck. But the same as it did not know to question its sky, it did not realize that the horizons of its world were anything but permanent. Not willing to sacrifice good glassware, and certainly not willing to return Julian to his first home in the cistern, Maxwell knew it was either kill him or find larger accommodations. The bucket would do nicely. Still, the convict keeper did not like the thought of drawing more water from the cistern for this creature. The rain had not come in weeks, and the water level was halfway to the bottom. I will not even give myself water to bathe, but Julian gets a larger tank. Maxwell smirked as he dipped the bucket into the cistern and drew it out. Whether it was morbid fascination or an attachment to this oddity of nature that drove him to keep the eel, he could not say, but he could not imagine ending the experiment now. At least some of the bucket's contents would come from Julian's prior tank, which Maxwell certainly had no plans of drinking after how much time the eel had spent in it. The convict keeper turned the glass, slowing the pour to ensure that no water splashed out of the bucket. He expected Julian to panic at the sudden change to its tiny world, but it had stilled. Then the eel surged forward and launched itself from the top of the glass. Before Maxwell's eyes could even fully track the movement, he felt the wet impact in his lap. He expected Julian to flop and wriggle without water to buoy it. But once again the black and blue creature surprised him. The dorsal fin tensed, and Maxwell felt needles prick his forearm. Damn! Maxwell reeled back, shaking the eel, but Julian held firm. Despite the flashing pain, Maxwell remembered the water glass in his other hand and moved it beneath Julian. Sensing the familiar environment, Julian released and dropped. You bastard, Maxwell chided the eel, smiling now that he could see the bite was only skin deep. This is the last time I give you anything nice. Placing a hand over the top of the glass to prevent another leap, he poured the rest of the water into the bucket. This time, Julian went in without incident. Maxwell watched the creature circling the edge of its expanded pen and liked to think Julian appreciated the room to swim. Don't wear yourself out now, he said, patting the side of the bucket before standing to retrieve a bandage and a biscuit from the main floor. As he turned, a drop of blood fell into the bucket. He did not notice Julian's loop tighten to circle the crimson spot as it dissipated. 3 more days had passed, and Julian had taken well to his new accommodations. So well, in fact, that it had grown to nearly 1/2 meter, and I have not fed him a morsel, Maxwell thought, shaking his head at the tenacious creature. The gold eyes flashed in their perpetual loops beneath the lantern light. "Soon, I suppose I will have to release you to the sea," Maxwell said, chuckling. The convict keeper's stomach gurgled, and he turned back to the stairs to retrieve his usual meal of salt pork and biscuit. Typically, Maxwell would take his food while watching Julian, who had become a greater form of entertainment than the few crumbling books on the shelf above his armchair. But this evening, Maxwell felt a change in the air. The sun was far from setting, yet the unrelenting heat seemed to be lifting, more like the sunlight was fading. Moving to the salt-streaked window, Maxwell watched as the gray band of clouds moved across the eastern horizon, turning the Atlantic a deeper shade of blue. Blue morphed to white as a ferocious gust whipped the waves into a frenzy and sent sand swirling around the base of the lighthouse. Maxwell rubbed his hands together. At last, rain. Even so, the storm meant he had rounds to make. The water of the inlet boiled at the wind's urging, and Maxwell gave each of the knots holding the emergency launch an extra tug for assurance. He then secured the door to the oil shed, shielding his eyes against flying sand. Finally, he reached his most crucial duty at the opposite side of the light tower. With the surf pounding away in the background, Maxwell swept the rain collection dish free of sand, or as much sand as could be removed as more blew into it. He then opened the valve to give the coming downpour free access to the cistern. Everything secured and ready for the gale, Maxwell circled back to the stone steps and fastened the door behind him. The smashed latch had required more carpentry skills than his previous life as a thief had given him, but the patch job he had managed would be enough to hold through the storm. Or so I hope. Maxwell shrugged. At least the wind is coming from the opposite direction. Satisfied with his preparations, Maxwell retired to the armchair with his lantern and the one book he didn't know cover to cover, breaking the seal on the small bottle of rum the gendarmerie had given him. This is a special occasion, after all. An hour later, the storm broke, lashing the stones and glass of Maxwell's bastion with an onslaught of rain and renewed wind. He paused his reading to watch the torrent battering the tiny strip of sand. The waves from the Atlantic side smashed into the beach with foaming mouths, advancing farther and farther up the shore until they almost touched the stone base under Maxwell's feet. Still, the convict keeper was not overly concerned. St. Croix's lighthouse was built like the forts that had once stood on the points of Martinique, and that construction proved as adept at resisting the fury of nature as it had at deflecting the cannonballs and musket shot of British marauders all those years ago. This same resolve in the face of fury was on full display when Maxwell climbed the stairs to light the beacon a short time later. Despite being made entirely of glass, the walls surrounding him did not show any sign of giving way. For a while, Maxwell watched the rain cascading down the panes, their tracks caught in the beacon's gaze once every 15 seconds as the lens rotated in its perpetual orbit. He could not imagine sailing a ship in the boiling seas surrounding him on all sides. St. Croix's lighthouse offered the only warning a captain would have in these conditions before his hull smashed against the reefs that lay offshore. Despite being a prisoner, he had never neglected this duty. His father's ship was said to have gone down in these very waters 30 years ago. If only this great tower had stood then. Sighing, Maxwell took one last look toward the rolling water far below before climbing down the ladder to the anteroom. Secure in his stone tower and his stomach warm with rum, Maxwell read by lantern light in the growing darkness until the words blurred and his eyelids drooped. Somewhere in the constant din of raindrops and howling wind, A metallic clang woke Maxwell. Rubbing his eyes, Maxwell stoked the lantern wick back to alertness. It cast a shallow glow across the gray stones, barely penetrating the gloom that hung around the lighthouse. Then the entire room lit up as lightning struck offshore. Its flash traveled through the 50 different windows lining the walls of St. Croix, but Maxwell's eyes did not move up. Instead, they focused on a shape caught in the flare, casting a shadow on what should be flat stones. Julian? Maxwell's voice echoed as darkness rushed back in. The thunder arrived then, drowning out any reply. As the rumble faded, Maxwell felt a familiar smile creep up his lips. "That is you, isn't it, Julian?" Picking up the lantern, he walked forward. "Knocked over your pail and come upstairs looking for a new home? Your initiative continues to surprise me, my fishy friend. Now, let us get you back in the water before you perish." When Maxwell reached the spot he had seen the shape, he found nothing. A closer inspection of the floor revealed a wet streak. Swinging his lantern to follow the tracks, Maxwell caught a flash of gold reflecting back from the shadows. Then 100 knives fastened into his ankle. Mon Dieu! Maxwell stumbled backward, but his attacker held on. Swinging his lantern down, Maxwell caught the figure from the side and sent it flying back into the shadows. But once again, Maxwell did not know where it was and where it would come from next. It seemed the circle of lantern light was shrinking, as if even the light were abandoning him. Then Maxwell realized the light was shrinking. His eyes flicked to the kitchen, where the spare kerosene and the oar he used as an improvised weapon both lay. Taking a deep breath, Maxwell dashed across the stones. He looked to all sides for gold eyes, but nothing came out of the dark for him. Reaching the counter, Maxwell seized the oar and held it in front of him like a spear. Still, nothing emerged to challenge him. Waiting a moment more to be sure, Maxwell then set about refilling the lantern, spilling kerosene with his shaking hands. At last the flame returned, but no golden eyes reflected in the darkness. Oar in one hand and lantern in the other, Maxwell advanced over the stones. Around the lighthouse the storm had lightened, and the absence of raindrops smacking against the glass made way for another sound, a sliding, squishing sound. Maxwell walked forward, his head swiveling to check the shadows. Approaching the stairs to the cistern, his lantern light caught a pair of golden eyes. Then a second pair appeared. Then a third. Maxwell blinked, waiting for the lights to merge into one pair, but they remained apart, and he could hear more approaching. Dozens of dorsal fins squished through the shadows beneath him. A trio of eels crawled their way up to the top step, fixing their shimmering eyes on Maxwell. He swept his oar along the stair, knocking the creatures back, but the slicking sounds were growing in volume. Maxwell moved so he could cast his light down the steps and found dozens of yellow eyes reflecting from the dark. Julian's siblings. Maxwell felt himself transfixed by the golden lights. Then that feeling morphed to ice in his veins as the eyes all flared and advanced as one. His knees gave out and his grip loosened around the lantern. What had started as an involuntary reaction turned to offensive action as he thrust his arm down and released the lantern. The glass struck the stone, sending flaming kerosene cascading down the steps. 100 screeches traveled back on the blast of heat. Then the eel's flailing ceased. The flames faded, and the silence returned. But Julian already climbed the stairs. Maxwell turned, now armed only with the oar in the returning darkness. Above the St. Croix lighthouse, the clouds of the storm continued their march toward the west, revealing a half moon. The light filtered through the windows, painting the room in silver relief. Still, the eel did not reveal himself. Maxwell felt his confidence resurging and gripped the oar tighter as he set off in pursuit. Could I really kill him? The keeper paused. Either way, he cannot stay in here anymore. His stinging ankle confirmed that much. Halfway across the room, Maxwell stopped. Something had moved. Or had it fallen? He heard it again and realized the noise was not coming from the room at all. It was coming from the door. Thud. Maxwell turned and watched as the wood planking rattled. Thud. He started to move forward, eyes darting to the largest piece of furniture he could brace against the door. Crunch! Too late. The patch holding the latch splintered, Maxwell's subpar carpentry coming apart before his eyes. With a final blow, the door swung open, revealing a massive shadow in the moonlight. Golden eyes cut through the darkness of the room and centered on Maxwell. Maxwell dashed for the stairs to the beacon. Slipping sounds followed his pounding feet. Reaching the first iron step, the convict keeper turned and swung his oar, catching the creature across the head. Even in the dim moonlight, he saw the needle-like teeth flash. Seizing the moment he had gained, Maxwell dashed up the steps 2 at a time. A quick glance behind revealed the creature climbing after him. The blow had barely phased it. Through the blood rushing in his ears, Maxwell tried to think, to plan any sort of escape. The beacon room had a hatch at the top of the ladder. He could climb to safety and block its path. His ankle burning with the desperate rush, Maxwell stumbled to the ladder at the other side of the anteroom. He threw the oar onto the floor above before throwing himself at the rungs. Nearly to the top, Maxwell looked down. The beacon rotated over him and the hatch at that moment, illuminating his assailant already at the base of the ladder. It was, as Maxwell had somehow already known, a massive form of Julian, black with a blue dorsal fin. 8 feet of muscle contorted around the iron posts of the ladder as its yellow eyes flashed up at Maxwell from behind 2 short antennae. The giant eel's jaws missed his trailing foot by less than an inch, and Maxwell slammed the hatch shut. The keeper threw the iron bar through the notch, locking the entrance to the beacon room. He then turned to retrieve his oar. After a moment of quiet from the room below, Maxwell felt his breath returning. With that air came a new sense of security, and he approached the hatch to look through the gaps in the metalwork and see if the creature had retreated. Maxwell stumbled backward as the hatch bucked beneath his feet. A second strike followed, bending the metal rod that kept it from flying open. All Maxwell could think to do was back away with the oar held in front of him. This is the end. Then he realized he still had one more barrier to hide behind. A small hatch led out onto the lighthouse's catwalk, which he could then hold closed from the outside. Would the glass do any better against this creature that could bash its way through wood and metal? Maxwell doubted it, but he saw no other option. Clang! The floor hatch was now skewed toward the ceiling. The lock bent even further. Maxwell struggled to still his shaking hands as he undid the latches to the catwalk. At last, the iron panel swung outward, and the salt-laden wind swept through the beacon room. At the same time, the floor hatch gave way with a shriek. Maxwell only had time to turn before the creature launched itself into the beacon room. In another motion, its pointed face rammed into Maxwell's chest and flung him onto the catwalk. Only the metal guard rail saved Maxwell from plunging 80 feet to the sand below. Head ringing from colliding with the iron bars and the air knocked from his lungs, Maxwell blinked and remembered what was happening in time to raise the oar that had miraculously stayed in his hands. The creature's teeth sunk into the handle, sending cracks racing down both ends. Already familiar with the raw strength of his assailant, Maxwell received another lesson as the massive creature attempted to both snap the oar and push its jaws toward Maxwell's face in the same movement. The paddle groaned but held. The keeper could not say the same for his straining arms. 100 smells of rotting fish washed over Maxwell as the golden eyes blazed into his. In the terror of the moment, Maxwell's eyes caught another flash of gold, a ring fastened around one of the monster's teeth. Maxwell realized that both his feet were propped against the body of the eel as it pressed closer and instinctually kicked up. Both oar and keeper found themselves free, but the creature showed the same resilience as it sprang back at him. Maxwell rolled out of the way, allowing his foe to bash its head against the iron railing. Scrambling to his feet, Maxwell swung the oar and landed another blow as the creature turned. If the blow had any effect, it did not show it. Maxwell turned, now attempting to circle the catwalk and slip back through the hatch so he could lock it outside. His feet skidded to a halt as the golden eyes reappeared in front of him. It had anticipated his move and doubled back. Shit. The keeper found himself at a loss as now even intelligence lay on the creature's side, but the blue-black eel did not face any such dilemmas. It lunged, and Maxwell raised the only thing left to block its path. 100 knife points lacerated his forearm, and already Maxwell could feel the blood wetting his shirt sleeve. Gritting his teeth, Maxwell rose the oar with his free hand and bashed at the creature's head. Its teeth only dug deeper. Then the beacon's gaze caught both man and beast, and Maxwell felt the creature shudder in the brilliance of the light. That's it. Maxwell shoved the oar into the creature's mouth, twisting the handle to force the jaws open. At once, the paddle won the match. Free of the vice, Maxwell tackled the creature beneath its neck. He fought against the searing pain in his forearm and ankle as he hoisted the writhing creature, shoving its face against the glass as the beacon's beam approached. He closed his eyes against the light, which even his eyelids could not fully block. His assailant had no such option but to look straight on. A guttural hiss escaped its rows of teeth before seizures started all over its body. 8 feet of muscle suddenly threatened to overpower Maxwell and carry them both over the catwalk railing. Its moist body slid through Maxwell's hands as the creature climbed up Maxwell's chest and over his shoulder, seeking any relief from the brilliance that had just blinded it. In that moment, Maxwell did the only thing the creature's convulsions would allow. He threw himself backward, listening to the air whistle past his ears. Then, the iron bars caught him with a jarring impact. The eel, perched on his shoulder, continued his flight and flipped in midair. Maxwell watched as the jaws opened, teeth flashing above his shoulder and the railing. They closed on nothing but air, and the gold eyes blazed once before the creature went spiraling away into the darkness below. Clutching the splintered oar in his uninjured arm, Maxwell stared down, unable to believe that even such a fall would kill the beast. Yet the shape he spotted in the sand below did not stir, and at last he allowed himself to exhale. The adrenaline fading, his wounds and torn muscles now burned with newfound intensity, and he used the oar as an improvised crutch as he stumbled his way off the catwalk. As he kneeled to crawl through the hatch, something flashed on the black iron below. Maxwell reached down, picking up a ring, the same ring he had seen in the eel's jaws. I must have knocked it loose during the fight, Maxwell thought, noticing a tooth a few inches away. He pocketed the tooth, but the ring kept his attention somehow. After a moment, he noticed initials carved into the inside. K.P. "I'll be damned," Maxwell sighed, still too shaken by the battle to muster much more than sadness. This was the beast sleeping in our cistern. A heat rose through his chest, and Maxwell turned away from the hatch to the railing. "I killed your children, you bitch!" he shouted down at the limp shape. "I hope I've wiped your kind from the earth." The body did not stir, but as he turned, Maxwell thought he caught a flash of gold from the dunes. When he peered down again, it was gone. 3 days later, Maxwell sat on the steps of St. Croix Light as the supply ship Marie pulled into the dock. As he had expected, the gendarmerie approached with rifles drawn. "This better not be some ruse, inmate," A lieutenant, who identified himself as Vizon, barked at him while pointing to the yellow distress flag. The 4 men stayed back, as if the bandaged man in front of them might attack, and they needed to keep their distance for a good shot. No tricks. Maxwell shrugged at the man before gesturing at the broken door behind him. I'm just glad you came. We've had a few incidents here since that standard was first raised. Also, as expected, the gendarmerie believed almost nothing of what Maxwell told them as he hobbled around the lighthouse. He showed them the shattered door, and they shook their heads. He pointed out the burn marks and the charred bodies and fish skeletons he had collected, and they shook their heads. He showed them the broken hatch to the beacon room, and they shook their heads. He revealed his 2 different wounds, and this time they paused for a moment. Finally, they shook their heads. At last, he showed them the skull and other bones he had collected from the cistern. I have good reason to believe these are the remains of Klaus Pollard that eluded your previous search, Maxwell concluded. I believe the eel ate him and then used the cistern to hatch her brood before returning to the sea. She came back during the storm 3 days ago to retrieve them, and I happened to be in the way. Impossible, Vizon said, speaking for the group. What you describe is impossible. His words had less disdain than before. They came off more as someone struggling to process what he was seeing, someone struggling to maintain the balance of his current reality. Maxwell looked him in the eye. Then what caused all this destruction? You can accuse me of wrecking this place all you like, but no man could have broken the metal hatch like that. So what happened, Lieutenant? Vizon looked away for a moment. That I cannot say. Maxwell exhaled, a slight sense of relief. At least these men were not about to charge him with murder and destruction of government property. Whether or not anyone ever believed his outlandish story did not concern him as much. He would not have believed it either. But I know what I saw, what I fought. In either case, Vizon spoke again, it looks like this light station is going to need repairs after all the damage from the storm. His emphasis on the phrase told Maxwell that he would not entertain any more stories of giant eels and dead keepers, but the look in the lieutenant's eyes said he did not fully discount Maxwell's tale either, and that was enough for the convict keeper. Maxwell nodded. I couldn't agree more, Lieutenant. Indeed, despite all the evidence Maxwell had shown to corroborate his account of the events, he was missing the linchpin. The body of the creature had vanished when Maxwell searched for it the next morning, and all he had found after combing the isle was a group of tracks that circled a depression in the dunes before continuing into the sea. Julian had also vanished. When Maxwell had limped down the stairs and retrieved a spare lantern, all he found was a wet trail leading out the shattered door into the night. Finally, Maxwell had withheld one piece of evidence. As the gendarmerie officers collected the charred specimens and the human bones from the cistern into boxes, Maxwell reached into his pocket and cradled the ring. If the men had shown any willingness to consider his story, he had planned to show them the ring to further prove Klaus's fate. But they hadn't, and Maxwell found himself unable to part with it. It was proof that no matter what anyone else said, Maxwell knew the truth of St. Croix and its former lightkeeper. As the supply ship sailed off into the crimson dusk, Maxwell slipped the ring onto his finger. A trophy of his victory over the beast, but more so a reminder to stay vigilant. Julian had escaped, and something had moved his mother's body. There was still much work to be done cleaning up the wreckage of the last encounter with these creatures. Given his injuries, Lieutenant Vizon had offered to transfer Maxwell back to the mainland for treatment, but Maxwell found himself refusing. A new keeper risked sharing in Klaus Pollard's fate, and Maxwell could not shake the feeling that blood would be on his hands. Someone had to tend the light, someone who knew the truth. Maxwell hobbled over to pick up a broom and start sweeping up the ashes of the lantern fire, now that he no longer needed them as evidence. But he paused a moment into sweeping. He opened the logbook on the kitchen table and wrote a few lines. Off Martinique the foul winds blow, turning sea and surf to foe. But the greatest danger yet grown lies beneath, the unknown. A memento, a reminder. Most of all, a warning to any who might tend the light after him. Then Maxwell stood, picked up the broom, and resumed his sweeping.